Frenzy as the submerged, ugly truths about male sexual pathologies as, at that time, scarcely discussed in many quarters of apparently polite society, an inevitable urgent to address reality. Frenzy illustrates a foul corner of human or male behaviours, and not for the sake of entertainment. A sensation of disgust and horror abounds Frenzy far more so than even on display 1960s Psycho. Psycho was sensational escapism whilst trying to warn audiences of nightmares crawling in the unassuming shadows of society's fringes. Frenzy is an intensely motivated project. Distinct from Psycho, there is no element of mystery. We know the killer quite early in the film. It becomes the wrong man's kin, more so in a respect. Frenzy is trying to simulate the sensation of exceptionally cruel fate. The protagonist consistently framed for these violent murders, that fear of the preying murderer floating about the ecosystem, the psychological dimension that the victims of murderers occupy, that they ultimately never have any opportunity to share after. Or how one finds themselves celebrating Hitchcock's frenzy, insisting that they aren't a rather sick bastard somehow. As a technical exercise, praising frenzy is not at all challenging. To justify the film in the context of a skepticism toward such violent media, it is less easy than one could with, say, A Clockwork Orange, The French Connection, even Wild Bunch and Straw Dogs, or supernatural horror films about mystical demons, say The Exorcist or The Omen a bit later on. Was frenzy more or less intellectually inclined than those Italian giallos, purely expressionistic, gothic, and attempting to compose the most extreme of psychological spaces for sheer cinematic, modernist, transgressive, experimental bravura? Frenzy is not in the exact mindset of those. I suspect perhaps Hitchcock wanted his audience to feel utterly horrified by the proceedings as opposed to excited by the hints of sexual fetishism which could abound via psycho thrillers featuring female victims in Hollywood or pulp novels many decades prior. Here it is all on display. It isn't pretty, it is difficult, it is ugly. One considers a determined activist feminist auteur depicting such scenes in order to relay the indescribable, potentially trauma of the Rape Act, of sexual violence at large, of violence against women at large. Frenzy is so much less sensational or stylized than the other Hitchcock titles where its murder and violence is concerned, as though the director is attempting to arrive full circle and callously insist this stuff is not fun. It is petulantly horrifying, and maybe we ought not to enjoy it as much as we used to. Indeed, suspense, master of suspense. What is the suspense? Hitchcock claimed with Wrong Man to bring that up again, that part of the tension was that this story was true. Frenzy was also inspired, where the sick murders themselves are concerned, with true events, the infamous Ripper and some other murders which occurred in the UK during the 50s. Maybe it was time for Hitchcock's audiences to start considering violence not as distant suspense, based upon not knowing, but as material felt trauma. We know who the killer is rather early on. There is no tension in the scenes, just terror. The difference between the considered classy what will happen tension of Hitchcock's iconic suspense films and what occurs in the 70s grindhouse exploitation films is quite clear to all audiences, but the differences between Frenzy's violence and that of the grindhouse exploitation fare is actually generally superficial. Those films were obviously not about suspension and tension, but about exploiting, of course, the liberties their cinemas were allowed to show such graphic, gratuitous content. Hitchcock didn't seek to morbidly entertain, as the Jesus Francos, Tinto Brass, or Herschel Gordon Lewis and his imitators had. Hitchcock wanted men to know the fear that women might publicly suppress but are existentially aware of at any and all times. I suspect his philosophy of violence was closer to Sam Peckinpah's. It only was entertaining to the audiences incidentally. He wanted to traumatize them so that they could respect what the victims of violence have experienced across history to the present day. Consider John Ford's reconfiguring of the American West as rather putrid, ugly, bigoted, and a deliberate fabrication of the truth. See Sergeant Rutledge or The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, for example. Or Two Rode Together, though much less successfully in my own view. Even compared with his younger cinematic relative Brian De Palma has more in common with the Giallo artists where his violence is concerned, at least where Frenzy can be considered. Frenzy is one of the Hitchcock masterpieces and one of the most possibly justified in its depictions of extreme violence. If someone disagrees, feel free to let me know. I mean, I've defended and tried to justify the existence of, say, Fulci's extremely violent films, although here I would insist that the intent is or can be considered noble in the same manner that Peckinpah's depictions of violence might be. That's Frenzy. Once again, thank you all so much, yet again.